Chapter 2 of 10 from Infinity by Paul W. Fairman. Those in the know in Washington, D.C., upon seeing Brent Taber rush to a taxi or dodge a pedestrian on Pennsylvania Avenue, could well say, "There walks power." But there were few indeed who possessed enough knowledge of the Washington inner structure to be able to make this observation. Brent looked more like a coal heaver than a public servant with a well-oiled escalator into the White House. He appeared more able to direct a gang of dock workers than to jockey a delicate issue through the bloody jungle of national politics. Many of the people who accepted this deception did so at their peril and were not around anymore. To others not so foolish, Brent Taber symbolized a completely necessary facet of a working democracy: secret government. This necessity sprang from the realization that even an open society must maintain areas of privacy, or it is doomed. Such was the man, and such was his mission of the moment, an issue of the utmost secrecy. So hush-hush, in fact, was this mission, that when Brent Taber arrived at his office that morning and found Senator Crane pacing his reception-room carpet, his heavy eyebrows gathered, and he began mentally checking his tight ship for a leak. Senator Crane was the exact opposite of Brent, in that he looked to be exactly what he was, a figure rigidly typecast to the role of a blustering, tactless servant of the people, which, in Crane's case, meant that he was a servant of Crane's career and any faction of his supporters that could further it. Still, the senator could not be called dishonest. He was merely a flexible rationalizer. He sincerely believed that what was good for Crane was good for the folks back home. And just now he felt that a knowledge of what the hell was going on in Brent Taber's orbit was probably not good for anybody and had better be aired. As Brent entered, Crane came right to the point. "God damn it, Taber, just what in blazes is going on around here?" Brent's thick lips hardly moved, a characteristic that Crane found infuriating because that was the way shady characters talked into senatorial investigation microphones, and it looked pretty bad. But Brent's words came quite clear. "Routine business, Senator. An honest effort to get a day's work done." "You mean to tell me the meeting that's been set up here is routine?" Brent shrugged. "Meetings are meetings, Senator." Crane ticked it off on his fat fingers. "Pender of the Army, Bright of the Navy, Jones of the Air Force, Hagen of the FBI, Wilson from Treasury, they all trooped through here into your private conference room." He pointed pompously at his own chest. "But Crane of the Senate—" "You forgot Birch of the State Department," Brent cut in. "Or hasn't he arrived yet?" "Crane of the Senate is barred. Now just what in the hell—" There are times for tact and times for bluntness, and this was a time, Brent decided, for the latter. "What goes on here, Senator," he said, "is none of your business. Otherwise you would have been invited." Crane's face darkened, and Brent thought pleasantly of a brain hemorrhage blowing the top of his fat head off. But this was too much to hope for. "Brent," Crane exploded, "I'll get you. So help me, I'll get you. Just who the hell do you think you are, demeaning the dignity of the United States Senate? Just who are you to say what the people should or should not know?" "Decisions of that nature are made upstairs, Senator. I don't presume to possess the judgment needed in such matters." "You're an arrogant bureaucrat. Your kind comes and goes because when you get too goddamned arrogant, the people rise up in their wrath and knock you off." Marcia Hawley, Brent's secretary, was studiously transcribing some notes, and Brent turned his scowl on her because, damn it, she was laughing like hell at the whole thing. And by God, a secretary didn't have the right to laugh at a United States senator, even with her eyes, no matter how much a congenital idiot he was. "I'm sorry, Senator," Brent said. "If you have a complaint, please take it up with my superiors. Just now "Your superiors? And who the devil are they? Who can find them? Where do they have offices? Go around trying to find your superiors and nobody ever heard of you." Brent half smiled as he felt a sneaking admiration for Crane. The son of a bitch had a disarming quality of honesty. If he planned to knife you, he drove straight in, the knife held high. "One of the disadvantages of being a negative personality, Senator," Brent murmured. "Sure, you're about as negative as a charging grizzly." Crane snorted and headed for the door, as though his air had been cut off. After his bulk had vanished into the corridor, Brent turned a scowl on Marcia Hawley. "And what are you snickering about?" She raised large, blue, innocent eyes. "Me? I? Oh, golly, I just found a cute little Freudian slip in these notes and—
Shut up. Are they all here?
Birch of the State Department sent regrets. A duty call on the Tasmanian embassy or something.
Okay, and next week he'll be screaming to high heaven about being left out.
Marcia's laughing eyes agreed. Ain't it the truth? She marveled. Brent strode past her and expertly mussed her sleek hairdo in a quick gesture. As he entered his private conference room, he turned and grinned at her silent fury. Inside they were all waiting for him, seated around a teakwood table. The wall-to-wall carpeting was wine red. The chairs were deep and upholstered, and the men who sat in them were distinguished only by their surroundings and their uniforms. Their mettle and their worth were hidden inside. Brent moved to the end of the table and scanned them moodily.
Okay, gentlemen, I'll talk. Then if you have any questions, shoot them.
He took a deep breath and began.
We are faced with a situation that must be kept top secret for 2 reasons. First, it may be the first move in an attempt to subjugate or destroy our planet. 2, it is so utterly ridiculous on its face that a public announcement would be greeted by hoots of laughter from pole to pole.
Brent's ugly scowl deepened at what he seemed to feel was an injustice.
Even the Eskimos would get a yak out of it.
The group waited, withholding judgment, evidently waiting to see whether or not it was a laughing matter. They were conceding nothing. Brent studied them for a moment and then went on.
Last week in Denver, early in the morning, he said, a man was found dead on a residential section street. There was no apparent cause of death. A routine autopsy revealed some peculiar things about the man's insides. For one thing, he had 2 hearts.
Jones of the Air Force, a dignified, gray-haired man, paused in firing his cigar and gave the impression he was lighting his way through the darkness. Bright of the Navy, a thin man with a huge Adam's apple, allowed it to bob 3 times in deference to the startling nature of Brent's statement. Pender of the Army raised one eyebrow and let it fall. To a keen observer, Hagen of the FBI would have revealed prior knowledge by reacting not at all. His mind was on the kid. He was thinking, Christ, with all the damned miracle drugs and characters orbiting the earth in crazy capsules, they still haven't figured out a way to keep a 6-year-old from getting a cold. He remembered the kid waving from the window yesterday morning when he'd been ordered east to attend this clam bake, standing there beside Miriam, waving goodbye and barking like a sea lion. What the hell was wrong with doctors? Why didn't they get with it on a stupidly simple thing like the common cold?
2 hearts and—
Brent reached to the left and pulled down a chart on a window shade type rack that stood beside his chair.
A rather interesting arrangement of the internal organs. He pointed with a thick finger. You'll notice that the liver is exceptionally small, while the kidneys are large enough to serve as a horse. You'll note also that while the man had testicles, there is no prostate gland.
The group waited in a kind of guarded abeyance that could be easily sensed. Their silence gave the impression that they were asking, is somebody kidding us? But there was certainly no lightness in Brent's manner. His arm dropped and he scowled at the far end of the table as he said, Now the blood. There was something strange about the blood. The door from Marcia Holly's reception room office opened and she came in silently, followed by a white-coated waiter who set a tray on the table. The coffee pot on the tray was silver, the cups fine china, the napkins linen.
Something very strange about the blood, in that it conformed to all necessary specifications, and yet it had a synthetic quality about it.
Goose pimples formed on Hagen's neck and walked gently down his spine. Nothing was missing in this setup. Synthetic blood, 2 hearts, oversized kidneys. Hagen got a quick mental flash of a barker outside a circus sideshow.
He walks like a man, he talked like a man, but for a thin dime, folks, you can see—
It was something to think and wonder about. And back in Chicago, he'd had lots of company. Everybody in the office that night had wondered, and you could see the vague uneasiness in their eyes as the creature sat, acting like a human being, and at the same time, like nothing from this world. You could see a vague revulsion in the people surrounding the creature. There was also uncertainty, and this from men who were required by their profession to be fairly certain about most things.
The blood, Jones of the Air Force said. Could it have been a new kind of plasma? Hardly. You see, the variation was almost theoretical, if you can understand the term as I'm using it. Drawn from an ordinary human being, it would not have been questioned. It was just that in the light of other oddities in this man, it didn't seem right somehow." "Pretty vague," Bright of the Army said. "This I'll grant you," Brent said. "Anybody for coffee?" Nobody was for coffee, so Marcia and the waiter retired, and Brent said, "Vague, I'll grant you. But let's get on with it. 2 days later, a man in every way identical was found lying in the street in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was alive, but in a dying condition, and he succumbed on the way to the hospital. Cause of death, as in the first place, undeterminable. But the medics think it was some malfunctioning of the lungs. All in all, gentlemen, 8 identical specimens have been picked up in various American cities. 5 are dead. 2 more are now in a comatose condition at last report, and may very well be dead at this time. 1 is still alive and relatively healthy." Alive and relatively healthy, the son of a bitch. Hagen felt an odd, senseless rage against the creature they'd picked up in a Chicago bar. Ordinarily, it would have been a simple bullpen night court case, a loudmouth drunk refusing to pay for a drink. But much of his talk, anent enemy invasion, internal destruction, and civilian chaos, had been a little too rough for the other barflies to swallow, and complaints had been made. Later, when Bureau men went around trying to get something tangible in the way of evidence, they found themselves dealing in frustration. The complainants had left without giving their names. The barkeep really hadn't heard anything. The actual charges had gone up in smoke. But by that time, Washington was very much interested. The man was questioned, and it was the damnedest thing Hagen had ever gone through. "By identical," Jones of the Air Force said, "you of course mean—" Brent's dark, knife-like eyes sliced out at Jones. "By identical, I mean just that." Bright's throat bobbed as the astonishing implication came home to him. "Hell, man, you mean—" "I mean these specimens do not merely bear a resemblance to each other. They were not just similar as to organisms and physical structure. They are all exactly alike as 8 new cars of the same make and model lined up side by side." Identical? Hagen didn't know anything about that. He hadn't seen the others. But he knew that there was something frightening about the one they'd picked up in Chicago. At first glance, he could have been Mr. Anybody from anywhere USA. A youngish-looking 40, you would have figured, with a sprinkling of gray at the temples and a face women would have found interesting. He had the unpaunched figure of a man who had taken good care of himself. He was quietly dressed in a blue suit. He looked like a decent enough guy who just happened to have gotten stiff on the double hooker he'd ordered and sounded off without meaning to. In fact, he was still sounding off when they got him into the interrogation room. And when the barflies called his talk treasonable, they hadn't been fooling. Brent said, "Identical, gentlemen, even to the fingerprints, to the very last ridge." Pender's eyebrows tried to crawl up his forehead and disappear into his hairline. "That's utterly and completely ridiculous." Brent smiled. "Then at least I've gotten one idea over to you, that a public release on this thing would be greeted with hoots of derision by the realistic American public. And perhaps deservedly so." "I think not," Brent said gravely. Is it some incredibly ingenious hoax? Hagen asked himself the question and found no answer. He only remembered the words and the eyes and the tone of the creature that walked like a man. "He was our father. They had him a long time before we came. He was our father, and after we came they told us what we were to know, and we knew it." There it was, that odd little break, cutting off the word at the end of each sentence. It gave the impression of a mind groping, yet not really groping, a mind sure of itself, yet wondering. "What did you know?" "We knew what we were for, our reason. We knew what we were created to do here." "How many of you were there?" 10 of us." "You said created to do here. Where do you come from?" "There." "Where is there?" At this point, the man or the creature or whatever you wanted to call him pointed upward. At this point, Cantrell, another of the interrogation group, turned away in disgust. A kook with a religious compulsion, a character, and we got called out of bed to get you ready to be destroyed," the creature cut in. "By fire and brimstone on Judgment Day?" Cantrell asked sarcastically. "No,
by rendering you helpless, by—" Here the creature swallowed, blinked, and looked surprised, and changed magically. He, if it really was a he, didn't jump up and kick a hole in the ceiling or anything like that. In fact, nothing tangible happened. There just seemed to be an invisible barrier that rose suddenly around him. Then there was the thing that chilled every man in the room, a thing as tangible as the walls and the furniture, yet a thing no man could define in words. This was when Cantrell, a high-strung individual at best, reacted violently to the change in the creature. In an instinctive blaze of anger and frustration, Cantrell reached out and slapped him brutally across the face. Veely, the agent in charge, also acted instinctively as he lunged forward to restrain Cantrell. But then he froze, as did all the men in the room, to stare. It was not what the prisoner did. It was what he did not do. There was absolutely no reaction to the blow. No reaction physically, emotionally, or mentally. It was as though the blow had not been struck, as though this were some kind of a moving, breathing zombie. So tangible, so seemingly sourceless was this feeling of loathing that Hagen would have been sure it had affected only himself if he had not seen its effect on the others. Yet none of them referred to it. Nor was this strange, because there just weren't any words to describe the feeling one gets from contact with a pleasant-faced, quietly dressed example of the walking dead. Backing away from this powerful emotional reaction, Hagen forced himself onto an intellectual level and asked himself what had brought about the change in the creature. Why had it— Hagen now had to regard the strange walking enigma as neuter— after functioning to some extent as a human, reverted suddenly to what seemed to be its natural state? He conceded that if he knew the answer to that one, he could be of great service to the FBI and the nation, and no doubt to the world. Pender of the Army now had a question.
What information have you gotten from the surviving man?
Not a great deal as yet. However, in our experiments we've learned something rather frightening.
And what's that?
He is totally impervious to drugs of any description whatever.
That's impossible. So it would seem, but the sodium pentothal injection he was given could just as well have been so much water.
The group pondered this information, each after his own fashion. Then Birch of the State Department made a precise, scholarly observation. Incredible.
Brent smiled faintly. One point of vital importance. We do know that there were originally 10 of these creatures roaming the country. 8 are accounted for. The other 2 are still at large.
Jones of the Air Force asked, "Were all 8 apprehended in large cities?"
"Yes."
"Shouldn't that mean something to us?"
"Well, it's a pattern, all right, but no one's been able to give it any meaning so far."
No one had any further comment on that point. Brent waited a moment and then threw the bombshell.
"We are quite sure that these creatures are of extraterrestrial origin."
For a time, it seemed as though Brent's bombshell had been a dud. There was no comment from around the table, no sound of any kind, but each man was evaluating the information after his own fashion. The key thought, no doubt, other than a natural and instinctive moment of sheer unbelief, was that this marked a giant forward lunge in world history. And also, no doubt, in this group of responsible men, there was a common question. It would appear that our world had at last come to grips with the universe around it. Was our world ready? And there was general doubt. Now the questions came. From whence? To what purpose? Hostile? Benign? Dangerous? Harmless? What other information was gained from the creature?
Very little. He knows our language. He is here for a definite and clear-cut purpose, probably hostile. But what he was supposed to do or how he was supposed to accomplish it, we do not know." "Do you think you will eventually get these answers?"
"I think," and there was an ominous note in Brent's voice, "that we will. If not from the creature himself, then in some sudden and far more violent manner." This statement also had an impact. It seemed that the group had overlooked Brent's previous revelation that 10 of the creatures had arrived and only 8 had been accounted for. "Perhaps," Jones said hopefully, "whatever their plan, it required the participation of all 10.
"In that case," Brent said quietly, "we have nothing to worry about, at least at the moment."
"Are you of the opinion that these creatures have been dropped anywhere else on Earth?"
"All I can say on that score is that all seems quiet around the world. Of course, if Russia has rounded up a quota of these two-hearted characters, they wouldn't be likely to tell us. They certainly haven't shown up in the European countries with whom we consult. All I can say about the situation behind the Iron Curtain is that they have made no inquiries of us relative to the matter, and we certainly have made no inquiries of them. Also, our people in the sensitive eastern areas report nothing indicative." Pender bobbed his throat and said, "You told us you're sure the creatures are from outer space. That makes our interests with Russia mutual. Therefore, why shouldn't open inquiry be made?" Brent frowned. "An entirely logical question. As a matter of fact, I recommended that course. Nothing has been done in that direction, however, at least not to my knowledge." "I assume the White House knows about this?" Brent nodded, but did not elaborate, perhaps because to have done so would have tended to clarify his own connection with the top spot in the nation, a relationship accepted but not thoroughly understood by any man present. "May I inquire as to Senator Crane?" Bright asked. "I see no reason why you shouldn't. He was in your anteroom when I entered. Obviously he was mad. I assume that was because you excluded him from this meeting." "Correct." Brent Taber's eyes turned a trifle steely. "In fact, I'd like to know exactly how he found out about the meeting." No one offered any data on this point, and Bright asked, "Is it wise to keep information of this vital nature from the United States Senate?" "The information has not been kept from the United States Senate," Brent corrected. "Let's say it has been kept from certain United States senators, on the theory that the interests of the nation can best be served by a closed-door policy on this matter until it becomes clarified." Whether they agreed or not, the men present accepted this as coming from the top, and they would automatically abide by it. "I suppose," Pender said, "that every effort is being made to apprehend the missing pair." "Every effort of which we are capable." "What conclusions have you drawn from the fact that these 10 creatures are identical?" "That they are not human beings in the strictest sense of the word," Brent replied gravely. "Then what are they?" "We believe they are androids." "And what the hell is an android?" Jones snapped. "A synthetic." Brent smiled just slightly. "In this case, men not born of women. All this is detailed in the confidential report that will be handed to you when you leave. The report, incidentally, is slanted in a way that obscures its vital nature, but on the basis of what has been said at this meeting, I'm sure you'll find all your answers." Brent paused, waiting for questions. When none came, he said, "I guess that about covers it, gentlemen. At least, all that we have at the moment. You'll be kept informed. The meeting is adjourned." He glanced around. "Oh, by the way, as you'll note in the confidential report, this project will be identified as Operation Blue Sky." "Where did they get that one?" Jones snorted. "I don't know. The term originated higher up. Possibly," Brent murmured, "because somewhere out in the blue sky lies the answer." His manner changed and he glanced briskly around. "Would anyone care for a cup of coffee?" No one was interested in coffee, and the group filed out. 10 minutes later, the white-coated waiter came to pick up the things. He crossed to the coffee pot, lifted it, and took a tiny device out of the hidden space formed by the pot's legs and its bottom. This he slipped into his pocket before picking up the tray and going out as he'd come. End of chapter 2.